Hello everyone, my name is Rachel Trigg and I'm the Head of Research Program at AHURI. I'm thrilled to welcome you today to our webinar on overcoming constraints in Australia's housing construction. So a very pertinent topic that we have for you today. Before we get into any details, I would of course like to acknowledge the country that I'm presenting to you from today. So today I'm on Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country, and I acknowledge the custodians of this land, both in time immemorial and going forward, and would particularly like to recognise and welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. I'd also like to recognise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders face particular challenges when it comes to housing in general and have particular needs, interests, and have greater disadvantage when it comes to housing across Australia. And that disadvantage and those particular needs extend into construction. So the topic that we have today is also relevant in the context of thinking about our future. So moving to thinking a little bit about who we are. So who is AHURI? Who's the Australian Housing of Urban and Research Institute? We are bringing together of a range of different partners. So we are really lucky to be funded by the Commonwealth Government, by every state and territory in Australia, and by our 10 research partners who you can see there at the bottom, who are some of Australia's best and brightest universities and Australia's premier housing and homelessness researchers across the country. We're the only organisation in Australia that are dedicated to housing and homelessness research, as well as some urban research, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be part of that work today. So before we move into details, I'm just going to do one little plug, and I promise you only one. So in addition to leading housing and homelessness research through the National Housing Research Program, one of the other things that AHURI does is bring people together in person and online at events and webinars such as today's. We have an exciting conference coming up shortly, the Australian Homelessness Conference in Darwin. And I'm just going to do a little dad joke because I cannot resist. It's going to be a hot one. So it's coming up in October at the Darwin Convention Centre, and it is still open for early birds. So I think it's about a $200 savings if you sign up now, as opposed to after that early bird ends. So really hope to see some of you in Darwin to discuss all things homelessness in October. In terms of how we're going to focus our time today, we are focusing on a research report that was led by Associate Professor Andrea Sharam, who is here now, and I'll present a little bit more about Andrea in a moment. We have a copy of the research in the handout section. So if you go to the right of your screen, there is a sort of handouts piece, and a copy of the report is available there. The report is also available free of charge and without any hitches in download. You don't need to sign up or anything of that nature on our website. And on our website, there's also a research summary. If you don't have the time or the energy to read the whole thing, there is a concise research summary there as well. While Andrea will be our star attraction today, I'd also like to acknowledge the researchers who were part of the team who prepared this report and some associated working papers that are also available on our website. So we had an excellent team of researchers from RMIT University, Monash University, University of Tasmania, and the University of New South Wales, as well as representative from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. So thank you to that broad research team for putting together this work and the associated working papers work. So a few quick housekeeping matters. So in addition to having a handout function, next to the handout function, hopefully if you've sort of concertinaed the screen out, you'll find that there's a chat piece and a Q&A piece. And there's a little snippet there about what it should look like on your screen. So the chat is there to engage with your fellow attendees today. So by all means, please do share thoughts and insights as you go. And if you want to get the ball rolling and just let us know what lands you're joining us from today. I suspect we might have people from right across the country on a whole range of different lands. you can give that a whirl. But also then, if you have any questions for the researcher, but also for our other guest speaker today, then they can go into the Q&A function in the same area. So if you could pop the questions in the Q&A and the chat in the chat, that would be wonderful. We are going to be spending an hour together today is what we have scheduled, and we have had a range of questions already provided to us from attendees. So many thanks indeed for those of you who took the time to think about the research and to pose some gritty questions. We'll get through as many of those as we can. But there may not be time to cover everything, and there were quite a lot of really good questions for this one. So I suspect we probably won't be able to cover everything, but we will do our best. And also I'll note that some of the questions we received, I think, will be covered by Andrea's presentation. So that will be sort of a form of response to questions as well. So now that the formalities are largely completed, I would like to turn our attention to people. So the people we're lucky to have with us today are, as I've already let you know, Associate Professor Andrea Sharam, who is a leading researcher in a whole range of things relating to housing at RMIT University. And I'm going to make sure I get this right, to Dr. Rob Sobyra, who is General Manager of Research and Skills at BuildSkills Australia. Welcome, Rob, as well, and Andrea, of course, as well. Rob and Andrea both have actually really complex, interesting backgrounds and have worked in a range of roles relevant to construction, but also more broadly thinking about this sector and this industry. So I encourage and recommend that you look up their bios on the AHURI website, but also maybe even get in touch with them online on LinkedIn or other forums, because they both have really interesting work that they are doing and have done previously. So thank you so much, Rob and Andrea, for being with us today. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Andrea, who is going to work us through some key findings and some key things that came out through the work that her research team has undertaken. We're then going to move into a discussion between Rob, Andrea and myself, guided largely by those questions that you have provided, but also seeing some discussion between us. And I will keep an eye on the Q&A to see if I can weave some questions there as well that you might provide during the course of our discussion. So I'm now going to hand over to Andrea, and then I'll be back with you shortly to help guide the discussion between the three of us and in response to your questions.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, so this was an inquiry. So it was a program of work. So there's 4 reports that have come out of it. So there's the inquiry, which is sort of like the overarching part that sort of brings it all together. And that report includes what we think is the significant issues around the market and regulation. But we had 3 other projects, one that looked at international innovation, led by Andrew Beer from Adelaide Uni, detached housing, led by Sangari here at RMIT, and the apartment sector by Chilling Lee at UNSW. Of course, this kind of research, the usual kind of methods, with literature reviews, interviews, and so forth. But what was quite unique in this one is we did modelling, our hybrid systems, agent-based modelling, which I think will become increasingly important in understanding construction constraints. And of course, we used a system of systems approach, probably the first time that's been done in any major way. So just so that we can see what we mean a bit by a system of systems, here is a apartment sector. It shows that there's a very large number of subsystems within this overall system, and acting upon that are a huge range of other systems, which includes things such as monetary policy, fiscal policy, credit and taxation, even migration, even climate, for example, all impact those various subsystem components of the overall SOS, as we like to call it. And just so that we're really clear about what we're talking about today, this inquiry focused on the construction part of housing construction. In this particular figure, this is apartment development. So we weren't looking at approvals, planning permits, things like that. There was an assumption that, it was already permits issued, then how does the construction proceed? There were some issues with planning, however, but that was not the actual focus. And of course, the key finding of this research is that market volatility is the most significant strain on construction. So construction, housing construction is a very demand-driven production process. It doesn't actually have to be that, but that's how we do it. We respond to demand, and as a result, we have backlogs that emerge out of booms. So construction is largely a process which involves a sequence of tasks. You can create parallels. That's one way of getting efficiency. But basically, some things have to be done before others. So a key thing for a project manager is around scheduling of all those tasks and the people who have to do them. And where there's disruption to that, it causes queues for subsequent tasks. And it doesn't act in a linear way. So you might get a short delay in an early task, let's say, detached build, and, you've booked a scaffolding company to come and put the scaffolding up. They ring up the day before and they say, mate, we can't be back for another month. That means you're going to have to reschedule everything that was dependent on that. For example, maybe the window supplier was due to come in and, in 2 days' time. They may not be able to come back, in a month's time. So they might be, delayed significantly. So it holds up the whole process. So these delays mean that you get a backlog of what we call the work in progress. It's, that's the time that it takes for the project to become completed. Now, in a system that has extensive subcontracting, which is what we have, that automatically means there's challenges for scheduling. And in a system where there's a high degree of customization, that increases the complexity of that. Sales-driven production, demand-driven, that's inherently inefficient. But you've got these other things that act on it. So when there's a boom, there's a lot of competition for construction resources, materials and labour. That makes that scheduling really challenging. And builders also take on too much work, which increases that challenge. So what our modelling did, that systems hybrid agent-based modelling did, is we were able to see what would happen, if you took away market volatility, if you added workforce, for example, if you added technology, things like that. And what that really established for us is, market volatility is the issue. And, you can't add workforce to get the outcome you want without first fixing the volatility. So volatility, well, that's the boom and bust. It's a cycle, but sometimes I think even saying cycle is perhaps the wrong way of describing it. So the booms result in extended completion times and backlogs. You get a lot of supply chain pressures, so labour shortages emerge, which leads to, the price of labour going up. Materials tend to inflate in that time as well. The potential for some higher labour remuneration, it'll bring in marginal operators and underskilled workers. That has some real issues for defects. It also brings a lot of additional pressures to cut corners, and there's always a lot of pressures in construction to keep costs down. Of course, there's a very heightened risk of insolvency because all your costs are going up, but if you've got fixed contracts prices, then that's a difficulty. And insolvencies are higher during booms than they are in the busts. This is a very cash flow vulnerable industry. In the detached sector, what we see is, builders will take on the projects, they'll take the deposits and they'll hold that without actually starting. That gives them some cash flow to pay out people working on those other jobs. But that's a part of the reason why those backlogs emerge. And of course, we need to think about how busy everyone is in a boom. They're really too busy to scratch, let alone to be thinking about innovation or making substantial changes to the way they do things. So in bust, of course, there's a risk of insolvency. There's, firms also exit because there are fewer projects being initiated. We see, under and unemployment, so a lot of workers exit the industry. They'll go into other industries, but there's a certain proportion that just never come back into the industry. So there's a kind of a hole in our labour bucket, so to speak. And of course, if you haven't got many jobs on, if things are too slow, the builders don't have the capacity then to think about pursuing innovation or change. Now, in the downturns, things slow down, but it doesn't mean that all the builders get the opportunity to fully clear their backlogs. So in the apartment market, they tend to, because apartment investors, they tend to get out of the market. As soon as there's a sign of a downturn, they exit early. And the apartment development tends to start later in the cycle. So they're more likely to be able to clear the backlogs. But in the detached house sector, they don't, because they've taken on a lot and they've got this huge backlog there. They might still have backlog when that next upswing happens. So that explains why the detached house completions have been flat for the last 40 years at a time. So you can see here that bottom red line, that's the detached house numbers. That you can see they just really haven't moved since 1980. Population in that time has doubled. So what we can see in this figure is the impacts of those economic crises or economic events that happen that create downturns, but there's also those big upturns. And you can see into the 2023, the big lift there, that you can see that that's the impact of the home builder, the stimulus money that came in as a result of the pandemic. But we also, if you move back, you see the same thing happened in the GFC, where the stimulus measures act as they create booms, but they also create an inevitable bust that comes after. So, stimulus packages really need to be rethought because they're not really doing anything for the productivity of the industry, and it is generating a lot of insolvencies. We can also see there the introduction of GST was a big, it was a very sharp peak and downturn. That brought a lot of demand forward, but it's only ever bringing demand forward. It's not creating actual new demand. So that's why you get the trough afterwards. So for apartments, the completion times blow out. But the really good news in the apartment sector, and I'm glad to say there is some good news in the story. We can lift the production of apartments dramatically in response to demand. And we saw that in the 2010s. We absolutely smashed out apartments. And we think this is related to the fact that there are much larger firms, both developers and builders in this sector. But in the detached sector, there is actually limited capacity to lift production. Apartment can do it, but only if that demand actually exists. So apartment production is very much predicated on what's on market volatility. So this suggests, that there's a lot of fragmentation in the detached sector. There's a lot of very small builders, and that industry structure is a part of the problem. That we need to have building firms that have greater capacity. But having delivered the good news on apartments, there are other problems with apartments. What we see is the nature of the development process. It means that there's a lack of early design resolution. And basically what it means is the builds tend to start without everything being totally worked out, and there's always changes also after construction starts, and that really has a negative impact on the time that it takes, on the costs, and it increases the likelihood of defects. And of course, all of that creates liabilities downstream for future owners of those apartments. And so what we're really seeing here is, developers are really trading off. So I'm saying developers, not the builders, right? The developers are trading off the potential construction efficiencies through having everything worked out before you start digging in the ground, against the risk of a downturn occurring. So they're kind of watching the clock in a sense. They get their planning approval. After that, they have to get their pre-sales, and they will contract a builder in that time. But if the market turns and their finances pull out, then it all stops. So they're really trying to beat the clock in that sense, so that they're not going through the extra time and cost to get that early contractor engagement. So building regulations really, really important for what's happening. We think of construction as being an iron quality need to be balanced. Now, it's not balanced in Australia, really because we don't have a very strong regulatory enforcement system, and there's not a very significant quality assurance culture within the sector. So because there's always pressures to cut costs, but there's no countervailing pressure to keep the quality up. And that quality is getting sacrificed to ensure the margins are achieved. And builders' margins are very low. It is one of the issues for the capacity of the industry, and increasing use of design and construct contracts, of course, transfer all of the risk to the builder. There are lots of, there's quite a lot of dodgy building out there. They undermine the good players out there. You're competing on price often, but some people take an unfair advantage because they're cutting corners too much. If we were to have the kind of enforcement of building codes that is desirable, that would likely create a bit of a shakeout of the industry. And I think ideally what it would do is encourage more direct employment rather than the subcontracting, or at least much, much tighter alliancing. And it would help build the size, profitability, and the capability of firms. So you hire people. If you've got bigger margins, you can afford to undertake the training required of them, for example. And you might be able to move to more efficient systems. I mean, particularly if you had market stability, you could do all of those things. So the solutions, we need firms to grow. Their size needs to be bigger, their capacity needs to be bigger, and they do need to be more profitable. The average income for builders in Australia is just over $70,000 a year. It's lower than the average salary. Some tradies might be doing very well, but the actual builders are not so flush. We need to have a stable market, and that really means definancializing housing. We've had 30, 40 years of making very conscious decisions to financialize it, but we need to step back on that and de-link it from the general economy as much as we can. And in this way, what we've seen internationally is social housing and non-market housing can act as ballast in terms of market volatility. So it's a stability mechanism. It's not simply that you can up the amount of social housing under construction. If there's a downturn, it's very hard for housing construction to be delivered in a timely way in that sense. But if you have quite a lot of it, there's less private housing where the stability is generated from. We need to enforce the building code. Ideally, we really want much more standardization, because that's the thing that makes the actual, the tasks that people do easy to understand, and they can do it really well. It makes a much more efficient system. So that's where the prefabrication part of the deal comes in. But you can just simply have completely standardized house designs, for example. I'd like to see a shift from contract markets, that's really what we have for detached and for apartments, to perhaps a build then sell model, and that would also go into this what I call apartment tenure segregation. Now, I'm not going to talk about those two things. They're very complicated to explain and we don't have very much time, but please feel welcome to dive into the reports for those arguments. So some final thoughts here, which really is about the willingness to change here. Like the builders recognise that market volatility is very problematic and is the cause of huge inefficiency, so that they recognise that. they really do want to be more profitable. Of course, who doesn't? But to that extent, that's why we tend to see the focus on planning reform and tax reductions. They want that burden to be lifted because it's a bit of an easy ask of industry to sort of look to government to say, you fix this problem for us. But I think the problem, for the industry beyond that is really that there's kind of an inertia because actually enough of the larger builders are making enough money. The margins are not high, but they're doing deals with a development might be $1 billion, and so even a 1% margin on that is still quite a lot of money. So if enough people are doing all right out of it, I think it's a drag on getting the kind of change that we need. Because the smaller builders out there, the ones who are only getting $70,000 a year, they just lack agency. They're not in a position really to do very much at all. And I think really significantly, we need to recognise that the boom and bust cycle is good for many players in this sector. So for developers and their financiers in particular, they get really high return on investment out of the boom cycles. It's high risk but high return. Do they really want to move to something which will be low risk but low return? It's a big issue that I think as a whole system we need to be asking the questions about that. If this is an industry in which I think the leadership is really fragmented. I'm not sure how that can change in order for the industry to be a significant player in trying to address the issues that we have. And of course, there's the politics of it. We've had these decades of financialisation, and this really has created political cleavages which are very, very difficult to overcome now. So hence our debate, the budget around negative gearing and capital gains. Financialisation's created a lot of winners. It's also created a lot of losers. So there's now sectorial interests involved in that, and change will rearrange who's winning and who's losing. Thank you, Rachel.
Sorry, having a moment there to locate the mute button or unmute button. Thank you, Andrea. That was quite an ask that we had of you to condense the findings and the analysis that the team undertook over a good 18-month period and a comprehensive report that was very wide in its scope to a 15-minute or 20-minute or so presentation. So thank you so much for being able to touch on those points so somewhat ironically efficiently in the context of productivity. So this is demonstrating presentation efficiency. So we have quite a few questions, a couple that have come in today. And as I said before, we had some really good ones that came in prior to the presentations. I'm going to start by putting a caveat that we had some questions related to details of the planning process. So as Andrea set out in her presentation, the inquiry and the research focused on the construction part of the overall development cycle. And so we won't be focusing questions on the planning aspect today for that reason, because the research itself didn't focus on that aspect of the overall continuum. There's also one question of clarification, which I thought we'd just touch on very quickly, because that might help for quite a few of you who are part of the attendees. And that's, I'm going to put this one to you, Andrea. So that was a brief one about when the researcher was referring to, or when you were referring to apartments, builders and developers, what scale is that? So is that the medium, does that include the medium scale of say 3 to 6 stories, or are we just talking about the very high, high density, high height construction? So I think you might still be on mute, Andrea.
Sorry.
All good.
Doing as I was told to turn it off. There were sirens happening. Yeah, all apartments, wherever there's a cubic subdivision of space, it tends to mean that the triggers in the construction code change, as you're going up. So yeah, apartments mean literally anything that's just categorise that under the code.
So class 2 under the code, is that the kind of, or is that not quite the right definition?
Yeah, it is.
Great. Cool. Thank you, Andrea. And so then with that clarification sorted, the first area I'd like to focus on is, again, the people aspect, so the workforce aspect. And this, Rob, is where I'm going to bring you into the conversation. And because I'm not sure what it is about this topic, but one of the things about the questions we received is that they often had good preambles to them or included some context around the question being asked. So I'm actually going to read a little bit of that for you. So the first one around the people or workforce aspect that Rob, I'm going to put to you first, is around trades and trade capacity. So the question has been that trades and trade capacity are always referred to as the weak link in the industry's ability to deliver greater volumes of housing or greater productivity. They, the tradespeople, are not uniformly represented and essentially left to regenerate their own teams as demand rises and falls. So in response to the market volatility that Andrea set out. So the question then is, what do you see as the best plan to be sure the trade resources are supported, developed and retained for future demands?
Great question. Trades definitely are a bottleneck in the system. Another way to think about them is the sort of key person risk in the construction value chain. There's lots of licensing requirements, lots of, you've got to do an apprenticeship, and there's several gates you've got to go through to be able to particularly operate as a qualified trade. So completely agree. The boom bust cycle, which is well known to the industry as an issue, does have a kick-on effect to the workforce and the trades. We have come up, the system has created ways to work around this issue, particularly with apprentices. A recurring theme is a builder, if they've only got 2 years worth of work, how can they have the confidence to take on an apprenticeship that we know is a 4-year program? So that is a recurring issue in the industry. One of the ways that we work around that is with the group training organisation system, where instead of an employer hiring an apprentice directly, they hire through an intermediary. And if their demand falls away, then that intermediary can reallocate the apprentice. So that's a really effective way. And there's a lot of other benefits to that group training system as well. The problem at the moment is it represents about 8 or 9% of the housing construction apprenticeship pipeline. So that's definitely one opportunity where we could leverage that existing system, which is a little bit embryonic, even though it's been around a long time and it's a well-proven methodology. But if we can find ways to get a greater share of the apprenticeship pipeline into the group training system, I think that would be one tangible way that we can deal with this boom bust cycle as it impacts the trade pipeline.
And that group training system, Rob, is that in operation across Australia? Are there certain sectors or certain jurisdictions where it operates more so? And does it also differentiate between the apartment building and the lower density home building?
So it does operate nationally. It is variable from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Some tend to use it more than others. It's even variable across occupation. So it's more occupationally organised rather than industry or sector organised. So, you being an electrician or a plumber rather than working on apartments, working on houses. So, the structure is there. It's proven in all these contexts, whether it's plumbers in apartments or electricians on solar farms, like it all works. It's a question of scale, and there are lots of reasons why the numbers are so low, but a big part of it is just the cost. It's not hugely well subsidised by the government. So as a builder, to take on an apprentice through a group training organisation, you've got to pay them a management fee, so it's cheaper for you to just hire one. So there's a whole bunch of friction in the system that I think could be looked at.
Okay, great, thank you. And Andrew, I know that the team looked at workforce and matters relating to workforce as well. For you, were there any other things that you would incorporate in key aspects of a plan to, and just going back to the language from the question, to be sure that trade resources are supported, developed and retained?
Well, in a sense, what we ask of the system now is that we produce enough to cope with the booms, which inevitably means we have a surplus labour force during the downturns. I mean, for skilled trades, there's a huge lag time. It's 4-year apprenticeship, so you can't turn that tap on and off with the volatility that's happening in the market. So if we want to have the right number of people, we really need to address that market volatility problem. And that was illustrated to me a week or so ago in a workshop where a manufacturer of prefabricated components was talking about that it takes them 9 months to get a semi-skilled person kind of up to speed enough to do the job. But in that time, they might have retrenched that person because of the volume of their orders moves around so much that that they struggle to get a full complement of trained people, because they have to lay some of them off, frequently enough. So it really indicates the degree of the challenge getting the right number.
And I know that there are some of you in the questions who are picking up your ears at the use of the term, prefabricated or MMC, and we will be getting to that shortly. So that's my little spoiler alert. But there is another question of a similar nature that also links up to workforce that I wanted to put to Robert and to Andrea. So this one is around capacity constraints and how that relates to the size and scale of many of both the builders and the trades that Andrew was referring to earlier. So this question asks, tax settings favour smaller businesses, no payroll tax, lower compliance costs. I could make commentary about that second part of the assumption about lower compliance costs, but we'll put that aside. Has this created a capacity constraint in innovation and workforce development? So bring those two things together in the construction industry in Australia. So Rob, again, I'm going to put this to you first for your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely it has. I mean, in a very real sense, the kind of industrial transformation, the industrial revolution just sailed straight past construction and didn't change it. We're still very vertically disintegrated. We resemble a sort of, non-industrial, craft-based kind of industry structure that has a preponderance of extremely small firms where no one's in a very tight alliance. And teams form to do something very bespoke, and then they disband again, and then they reform over here to do something entirely new. So that is no way to build deep human capability. That sort of thing comes with scale and comes with vertical integration, which has just construction just hasn't found a way to make that work. And it's got to be said, a lot of construction companies have died on the hill of trying to build a vertically integrated company using modern methods of construction and prefabrication and so on. So there's something deep and structural about the way this market works that makes it very hard to consolidate and integrate in a way that allows you to get that deep workforce capability development going.
Andrea, anything you wanted to add to that? I think Rob's covered a wide range of areas there. But any additional words from your work?
Yeah, look, I agree that it definitely affects the capacity of the industry. Yes, so it's predominantly self-employed contractors, and the taxation settings have been set to encourage that over direct employment, and that that's historically been a deliberate decision of governments addressing, of course, labour unionisation and those issues. So it might have delivered flexibility, and flexibility is what you need when you have high degrees of market volatility, but it's not what you need if you want a really efficient building system.
Well, I think I'm going to not resist the tide any longer. There are quite a few questions around prefab and MMC. And Rob, some of your words, I think, maybe have steered us in that direction as well, about it not being an industrial craft-based structure and requiring scale and vertical integration. So I'm going to go to a frame of question that one of our questioners from the prior to the presentation provided, but there are some very similar themes coming through in questions from people online to date as well. So I think this will steer us into that territory too. So I'm going to put this, Andrea, to you to start with. A question has two interesting parts, but I'm combining them, particularly based on your work, where I know there was some case study analysis and a whole chapter in your report around MMC and examples internationally. So the questioner asked, how does Australia compare to other similar jurisdictions when it comes to construction productivity and costs? So I know that you have a whole report or a whole working paper on that, so we won't dive into it in too much detail, but connected to that, the questioner asked, what role does manufactured homes have on this productivity gain?
Construction in general, not just housing construction, globally has been a concern. The productivity has been a concern for decades, right? So that's a context. We're very similar to our peer countries, and especially those who've got very liberal, open economies. Very difficult for us to get our housing supply house in order, so to speak. So what contribution is the manufactured housing making? Well, even in those countries which are the exemplars, it actually is not a high percentage. And Rob, you used the died on the hill. I mean, there's a lot of companies who've died on the hill of prefabrication, especially volumetric prefabrication, because the huge issue for it is it puts all the capital into a plant. And, for the return on investment, the biggest threat is market volatility. Like it's great when the orders are coming in, but when there's a downturn, the orders don't come in and you have all that idle plant and, lots of them just go out of business again. So it's definitely, taming market volatility is a critical point which we need to do if we want to have a successful NMC production.
So it's almost a precursor to that being a successful model in Australia?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
And just a quick point of clarification for those who haven't had the opportunity to read the report yet. When you mention the countries that are exemplars in MMC or prefab, are there any that spring to mind, just so that people can feel well informed about that?
I'm sure a lot of the audience are very well informed already, but of course we always like to think of Scandinavian countries and the Japanese countries, and I mean their sectors came in at times in their history, at pivotal points in their history, of course with very strong public sector intervention to help make sure that they could start getting the level of housing production that they needed.
Okay, and this might be a good segue to then through to you, Rob. So from your work, does that public sector intervention, is that a feature of the Australian system? And what kind of workforce transition might be needed to make those systems effective in Australia?
Yeah, well, I think to your first question, the only thing keeping MMC where it is at the moment is public sector investment. And I think that speaks to Andrea's point there. In Queensland, there's a very strong MMC for social housing program that is generating a lot of this investment and pipeline. New South Wales is leaning into this space more. So as long as that keeps going, it can create, as Andrea says, a ballast that creates stability on the demand side that these need. Whether that can then spill over into the private market, there's definitely areas of the private market where MMC makes a lot of sense with hotels and things. That's often considered to be a right target for MMC. There's a lot of commercial, obviously, factors around that as well. But yes, I think the point's well made about public investment. On the workforce side of it, we're actually putting the finishing touches on our own report, if I can plug that. on the job and skills impacts of MMC. And it's quite interesting because in one sense, it's a labour efficiency play by definition. It's a labour productivity play. So in a real sense, it de-skills the workforce in the sense of stripping out the amount of labour hours you need in order to produce a built environment output, but also reducing the amount of skill content within those labour hours by shifting it out of the crafts people into the machinery on the plant floor. So there's this sort of shift of the skill or the human expertise from the back end of the construction process, delivery on site, to the front end of the construction process. It's much more sensitive to design, planning, that sort of thing. And then on the factory floor, obviously, you've got semi-skilled labour rather than high-skilled craft-based fabrication labour, doing assembly work instead of fabrication work, and then a lot of logistics and stuff around it. So there is a real skill transformation, and I think it's interesting. I think it has the potential to unlock a lot of the productivity that we need in order to produce more housing at scale and sustainably, rather than in a one-off way like we had with the apartment boom that Andrea mentioned. So I think it is interesting whether this government investment is enough to create and hold the industry while the private sector can then take the benefit of it. I think we will learn that over the next 5 or 10 years.
So reducing market volatility and then seeing if we can make that transition over coming time to scale up the sector to make better use of these technologies.
So we had an interesting interview with a US-based manufacturer, volumetric manufacturer, and they were saying they still have workforce issues, even that there's a skilled workforce component, but there's the unskilled. Mm-hmm. The unskilled one was still really problematic. Partly, it's the US context of very low wages, where their workers take every opportunity to go get a better paying job. So that would, I think, have to be something we really need to think hard about, is what those lower paying jobs would be competing with. If you want them in there and stay in there, we're going to have to offer the right inducements.
Which goes to a whole other range of supports and structures. I'm going to almost circle us back a little bit now to Andrea. You mentioned, not in passing, but we didn't have the opportunity to elaborate on it much, about potentially using social housing and other forms of public housing investment as a counter-cyclical measure. And Rob, you started mentioning that as well as a potential way in which MMC could help build the scale while, the private sector sort of gets acquainted or takes that on once there's the scale available, the supports are there, the structures are there. So we've also had quite a few questions, a few before and a few today as well, that go to these matters. And then one also today that has taken it one step further. So the question that covers a few of these things, plus another idea, is that the stats show that we need ongoing construction for the next few years to meet need, e.g. the public housing waitlist. Could a government construction agency overcome market volatility? So the questioner there hasn't directly linked up the counter-cyclical investment and the agency piece, but I suspect that may be part of the thinking behind it. So this is somewhat of a double-barreled question. Rob or Andrea, who'd like to jump into this one first?
Well, interestingly, the time when we produced the most housing was, post-war, when governments built it, basically, and that's true in the UK. So there's something to be said to having a big agency for whom that is their role. Yeah. But, there's been deliberate decisions to dismantle that kind of institutional infrastructure around the construction process.
And Rob, when you were thinking about greater public sector involvement in preparing for MMC, was this the type of thing you had in mind, or was this an outlier idea for you? Yeah,
I think it's a question of scale, and I'm not sure at the moment public housing is about 2% of the housing market. what percent would it need to get to provide that stabilising effect on the boom bust cycle? I don't know, Andrea, maybe your agent-based simulation can sort of come at that kind of question. I think that's the key one. And then does the political economy of Australia have an appetite to lift government investment in housing to those sort of post-war levels?
And this is something that's the specific quantity that would be required to have that effect is also something that other questioners have asked about as well. So I think my understanding is probably about 4% of social housing, not in terms of construction, but in terms of existing product or existing stock. So how much more investment in social housing or construction of social housing would be needed to have that kind of impact? Do you have any gut feel around that, Andrea, or is that a little bit beyond scope at present?
A little bit beyond scope, but it needs to be substantial. I think we're talking, 20%, maybe at least. You've got to think about what it needs to displace a certain amount of the private sector activity that's happening out there on which the volatility is acting for it to be the ballast. But, we could also think of it in terms of, this is a whole segment of the market that's really not being housed very well currently through our current, mechanism. So maybe, the amount needs to be set at what we need at in social policy terms. It's not necessary. I don't think it's absolutely necessary to actually have a government agency. It's about alliancing. So this is one of the great success stories from New Zealand with their public housing transformation project that they're doing. And that they have completely ignored MMC. They're saying, no, we can fix up in situ construction. And they literally did 1,200 interviews, a time and motion studies. And it was like there's a death by 1,000 cuts to productivity. They just work their way through them to reverse all of those things. And of course, they're turning out a lot more houses much more quickly and much more cheaply than previously. And this is, all the IP is free. They want the private sector to come on board and take the lessons away. So that would be a fantastic step for us to do, because in situ is going to be around with us. It will always be around. And it's probably always going to be a substantial part of the production process, but it can be vastly more efficient than it is.
So perhaps while we're thinking about places further afield, in Japan or in the Nordic countries, and thinking about MMC, we can also be looking directly across the ditch and significantly improving in situ as well as
and even to the US, where you've got house builders there who are churning out 50,000 houses a year. The advantage that they have is they do what they call tract housing. So they just build a set of standardized designs. That's what creates efficiency. Now in Australia, there's a very strong belief that the customer will not tolerate that. The customization we have, is extreme, really. But I think, and the reason why that kind of standardized, build then sell model that's common in the US doesn't happen here, is because of the financing. Builders can't really get the finance to do the model in that way. One of our workshop participants was talking about, they decided to explore that. So they started off, they built a duplex and then put it on the market, and went like that. And they couldn't get money from a financier. They had to use, the amount of, their internal resource to do that. They got up to a 12 dwelling development, and it sold like hotcakes. And they said that their margins increased dramatically on that because they built the same thing. They could do it fast with fewer defects. So they were able to build better quality. And, the people who bought it got good houses out of that. And, and they probably got, they would have paid market price, but they got a really good house for that. We need more of that to happen.
Well, that, and also the fact that the clock is ticking down rapidly to 1 o'clock, brings me to a kind of final wrap-up question for both of you. And Rob, I might start with you for this wrap-up one. So this one is a sort of broad one. So based on that evidence, so everything that we've talked about, everything in Andrea's report, and also everything that BuildSkills is looking at and has been thinking about for a long time, what reforms do you think would deliver the greatest marginal increases in housing supply if governments were to prioritise one or two interventions?
Just a simple question to finish.
Yeah, just an easy one to finish up on. Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about housing supply as opposed to the efficiency of the construction process per se.
That's what the questioner asks. You may or may not assume that behind that is a productivity question, but
yeah, look, frankly,
to any intervention you think is most critical.
I do think productivity is the key theme. I mean, the Housing Accord ambition represents something like a 40% uplift on historical housing completion. There is no way we are going to be able to mobilise enough labour within the current paradigm to achieve anywhere near that target. So if you accept that as some desirable goal, I think we need to find ways to be more productive. I think there are levers available to government to make the industry, the supply of dwellings, that is, not just the construction value chain part of it, but the end-to-end process. I think there are levers to make it more productive. I do think MMC is part of it, but I also take your point that there's a lot of opportunity for efficiency within the existing construction paradigm without having to sort of tip it on its head and go completely off-site and prefabrication. But I do think it will require that level of sort of sustained government intervention to maintain these more innovative processes while they seed in the private market and are able to come to scale.
Thank you. And Andrea, for you.
Yeah, so market stability. It's the things sitting outside of the actual production process that need to be addressed first, and then you can get down into the nitty-gritty of all these little process changes that can happen. So the government did some good steps with negative gearing and capital gains, but even limiting it to new supply is kind of problematic because it's all very we have an investor-driven housing system. That's quite problematic. One thing to avoid absolutely is no stimulus measures that target housing construction. It actually is counterproductive. And I think the industry has been bracing itself a little bit as the war and the oil crisis have created new challenges. The government might think that that's what they need to do. No, please don't. Think of something else. But that's not the way to help the industry. That will just create a whole nother, lot of insolvencies.
Another boom bust cycle, to circle back to some of your early thoughts.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both. We have crammed a lot into our hour, I think. We have got to quite a few questions, maybe not directly, each and every one, but covered a lot of territory that has been asked of the questions. So thank you all for those. And I again encourage you to reach out to Rob and to Andrea to continue to think through what is needed collectively across Australia to increase the productivity of our housing construction sector. Before we go, I just have three very quick things, which I promise will take less than a minute. Number one, there is a very short survey coming to you. It is super helpful for us if you complete it to help better run these sorts of events to meet your needs. So we would very much appreciate it if you were able to just quickly fill it out. This webinar has been videoed, so it will be up on our website in a couple of days' time, freely available. So do look that up, and if you have colleagues that might find it interesting, then they can look it up there. And also, if you're interested in work of this kind and getting the latest updates, we have an e-news subscription service available on our website. So again, pop your details down there. And I think that gets us to pretty much bang on 1 o'clock. So thank you all for your great questions before and during, and particularly thank you, Andrea and Rob, for your insights, your deep thinking on this topic, and your participation in today's discussion. I suspect it will by no means be the end of these types of discussions, but hopefully a really important part of a lot of change to come. So thank you both so much. We really appreciate it. And thank you all. Hope you have a lovely afternoon, everyone. Thank you.